turn to John chapter 5, please. Have you ever considered time travel? Now, a generation ago, people were captivated by the subject. There were the Back to the Future movies. Not long after that, Michael Crichton wrote a fiction book called Timeline about some time travelers. And they went back to a specific year, 1357. Not sure what that year was about, but they had a wide range of intriguing adventures as they went back there. Interestingly, in his fiction book, Timeline, one of the four travelers actually wanted to stay back where he had visited. He liked it so much. I don't want to go back to modern times. The three returnees came back, and they got an idea because they had some kind of arch nemesis, a bad guy, and they said, if we can somehow get that guy into our time machine, we're going to send him back to the Black Plague. And they did, in fact, do that, and it all took effect. And I thought, well, that's one way to deal with your enemies, if you could get them into that time machine. So I want you to think back 38 years ago. How many weren't even a thought yet 38 years ago, right? You hadn't come up with that yet. What were you doing? 38 years ago, I hate to confess that I graduated from high school that year. But I am glad to confess I met my wife that same year. So 38 years ago, that was a good year. What about 38 years from now? How old are you going to be in the year 2056? How many are dead? Imagine your life. Imagine if your life today was the same as it was 38 years ago. Your economic situation was the same. Your physical situation was the same. Your relational environment was the same. Imagine if it was exactly the same from 38 years ago. Imagine if in the year 2056, nothing changes for you. You're not any better off. Your relationships aren't any stronger. You haven't made any new friendships or any of that. I would say that would have a hopeless feeling to it. Hal Lindsey said it like this: a person can live 40 days without food, 3 days without water, 8 minutes without air, but only 1 second without hope. Hopelessness comes when you're in a deep hole with no sign of a way out. Hope gets sucked dry when time after time circumstances seem to work against you, and before you realize it, time has gone by and there's been no change, no remedy. Hope shrivels when a person makes the same mistakes over and over, and they hate themselves for it every time. They seem to sabotage themselves, or circumstances have conspired against you, and man, it's your last hope, and you've lost hope. What do you do when you're among the despairing? Today we're going to look at an individual in complete hopelessness because of his complete helplessness. And 38 years is going to be a key number for us. So let's look at verse 1 of John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, and they're waiting for the moving of the water. They thought that an angel would come and stir the water, and if they could be the first one into the water, then they would be healed. It was kind of a legend that they had. Look at verse 5. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time. He said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. So let's offer a couple of observations as we get started. Some sort of details are given to us in the story. In verse 1, it says there was a feast of the Jews there in Jerusalem. 3 times a year, the Jews were called to come to the city of Jerusalem to worship at the temple. And one of those feasts in particular was called the Passover. If somebody says, how long was Jesus ministering in a public way? The answer is usually 3 years or 3.5 years. And the primary reason we know that is in the Gospel of John, he references the Passover 3 different times. That Jesus crossed over the Passover 3 times. And here it doesn't tell us which feast it was, but it was a feast of the Jews, one of those 3. And we know that every time that happened, the city of Jerusalem was inundated with an influx of like 100,000 more visitors as Jewish people from all over the region traveled so that they could worship at the temple. So the streets were packed, and Jesus stepped out of the busy streets into a place called the Pool of Bethesda. The word Bethesda means house of mercy. As you find city places in the Bible, you might make a note or look for the prefix Beth. It means house. Like Bethlehem means house of bread. And how interesting that the bread of life was born in a place called the house of bread. There's another city in the Old Testament referenced a lot called Bethel, the house of God. And here it's Bethesda, the house of mercy, and it's near the sheep gate, a little interesting note. But in the wall at the city of Jerusalem was a gate, an entrance that was lower. A person couldn't walk through it, but sheep would come through there. Now, why would they need sheep in the city limits of Jerusalem? What would they have been doing at the temple? Offering sacrifices. So, you that have sheep at your place, what did the sheep gate smell like there? I was just trying to help you think a little bit, and it crossed my mind maybe it wasn't the best smelling place around. So at this place of mercy, near the entrance where the sheep were, was a pool with 5 porches. And 5 porches, I can picture 4, one on each side of the pool of water, but it's thought that maybe there were 2 pools with the 5th porch in between. So we're just trying to picture it. But these porches, there was lots of places for people to rest, sit, lie down, and it was full of sick people. It talks about the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, and they're all waiting for this legendary water to stir, whether it was a spring and water would bubble up, we're just not sure. But they're all waiting for the legend of the water. So without these porches, this Pool of Bethesda area, what would a room full of very sick and desperate people be like? What would have been the sounds in the room? Because you only went to this place if you were desperate. And you only stayed there if you had limited mobility. What would it have smelled like? I talked to a medical person a while back, a few years ago, and then I kind of researched, what do medical people do if the person they're dealing with smells bad? And there's all kinds of tricks. I don't know if they'll tell you any of them, but I read about some of them. So imagine the sounds and the smells of the place, and Jesus goes there. And he walks in. Nobody wants to go in that place. It would have been the sickest people in town, the most despairing people. And this man that we're talking about has been in this place for 38 years. I've had people that have been in jail, and for them it was an awakening time. As they looked around and they've said to me, man, I looked around and I realized what I had become. Look where I'm at. Look at the path I'm on. Look where it's brought me. So how do you think this paralyzed man felt about himself if he's here at this place for this long? As he looks around the place and says, this is who I am. Nothing has changed year to year to year. There's no hope. I'm one of them. This is the best I've got. Jesus healed another paralyzed man. Maybe you remember the story. But in this case, 4 people carried him on a stretcher. And they couldn't get to Jesus because the crowd was so large. Do you remember what they did? They went up on the roof and they broke a hole in the roof and they let him down. That paralyzed man had at least 4 friends who went to great effort to help him out. This man said to Jesus, I don't have anybody to even move me closer to the water. I don't have anybody in my life. You talk about hopeless. He said, I have nobody. He didn't have any physicality to get himself in there. He didn't have any relational help and assistance to get himself in there. Now, when it comes to this stirring of the water, we look at that and we think, well, that's kind of silly. Did it do any good? I don't know that. But if you look back on ancient healing techniques, there's a lot of bizarre things that people have believed over the years. George Washington was sick with an infection. You remember what he told the people that were caring for him? They called it bloodletting. They thought that if you bled the person excessively, that the bad germs would get out of them. And instead, George bled to death. They used to use mercury as a medicinal aid. And so they thought that if you treated people with mercury in some fashion, that would help them. Little did they know there would be a character called the Mad Hatter. Mercury was used in the hat making business, and it created insanity in the people that worked around it. There's a lot of places in the United States where there's hot springs. Hot Springs, Arkansas, I got to visit one time, and all down the main drag, there are these spa houses that in the 1800s were great places people would go for healing and revitalization and such. And there's a lot of places like that. Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and Sarasota Springs, New York, where people just 100 years ago would travel to find some relief for whatever was ailing them. And for this guy, it was the only option he had. Where else is a guy going to go that's in that situation? He has nobody with him, nobody to help him. That verse 7, that phrase, I have nobody to put me in the pool. I don't have anybody that's here in my life. At what point would you have given up hope if you were that man? At what point would you have been so discouraged to look around at the environment and look at yourself? Nothing's changed. After 5 years, I'm still here. Nothing's changed after 20 years, I'm still here. Nothing's changed after 3 decades. How long were you picked on before you gave up hope of having good friends? How long were you fighting with your spouse before you gave up hope on that relationship? How long were you sick or isolated before you gave up hope? And Jesus enters into that. He moves toward need. He steps out of those busy streets, and he finds one despairing man. So let's make a couple of observations about Jesus, shall we? In verse 6, it says, Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been in that condition a long time. I have those words underlined. Jesus saw and knew. He knew already that he had been in that condition. Just as God saw the Hebrew slaves and knew of their affliction, God saw this man and knew of his suffering. God knows. And you are not suffering alone. You're not in isolation. God sees you and God knows you. And he knows you in your loneliness, and he knows you in your fear, and he knows you in your weakness, and he knows you in your sin. When you think that you're alone, God knows When you think you're alone in your sin, God knows and He wants to forgive you. When you think you're alone in your grief, God knows and He wants to comfort there and be there for you. When you think you're alone in your victimhood or illness or conflict, God sees you and He knows. Jesus knew it had been 38 years. When you know Jesus, you know somebody who knows you. When somebody's given up hope, man, they look at themselves and they say, nobody's like me, nobody knows, nobody understands, nobody knows what it's like to be me, nobody can grasp it. And for the Christian, that's not true, because Jesus knows. I like what Psalm 139 says, verses 2, 3, and 4 in there, where it says, you know my sitting down and my rising up. You know when I sit down, you know when I get up. God, you know my thoughts before I think them. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You know where I'm headed. You're acquainted with all my ways. There's not a word in my mouth that you, Lord, you know what I'm going to say, and you know what I said. God knows you, and you're not alone. There's no hopelessness when God is there. God knows you. And how desperately people in our culture need to know there's no such thing as hopelessness when God is involved. His knowledge. Somebody knows you and somebody understands. And that's Jesus. His compassion is great because He goes into this place. He chose to enter this arena of brokenness. He wasn't lost. He hadn't made a wrong turn. He wasn't, oh no, don't go down that part of town. He knew what He was doing the same way He showed up at a well in Samaria, the chapter before, and met up with a woman who was broken in her sin. He moves toward need. Now, how about Jesus' question at the end of verse 6? Look there. Jesus says to the man, do you want to be made well? What a fascinating question. Have you given up hope? Is there any amount of belief in you at all? And the guy's answer was, I don't have anybody. I have nobody in my life that can move me a foot off of this place. And so he explains his predicament. And then verse 8, Jesus says to rise, take up your bed, and walk. Interestingly, there's no mention of the man's faith here. Jesus doesn't say, I believe you can heal me. Doesn't say that. There's no mention of his religious background or if he'd had his Bible reading that morning. Jesus' compassion here is extraordinary. At least nine times in the Gospels, the Bible speaks of Jesus being moved with compassion for people. And Jesus is moved by the misery and the affliction that He sees. His power is immediate also because He heals the man. Rise, take up your bed and walk. It's immediate and it's sovereign. Powerful. It's in charge. When Jesus spoke, diseased muscles and bones obeyed. Atrophied muscles, inactive nerves suddenly worked instantly. Now, I don't know what the time frame is, but you and I have heard of people that were bedridden for a period of time, and then they slowly begin to get their strength back. But they need all kinds of therapy to retrain their legs and their brain to work in sync so they can walk again. They have to learn how to do that. All that happened instantly with this man. Those muscles that hadn't worked 38 years worked instantly. Now, last week we learned that Jesus healed a man 20 miles away. Here we learned that Jesus healed somebody whose muscles had been atrophied for 38 years. It wasn't like he'd spent a couple days in the hospital and his legs, got a little weak and he was a little winded. These things hadn't worked for decades. And he was healed immediately, and everybody could see that. Jesus healed obvious illnesses. And the cures were always obvious as well. And he healed serious illnesses. It all came together. And immediately, the man was made well, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, if that's all there was to this account, this would be a tremendous story of hope that can be found in Christ. And I want anybody that hears this message to know that there's hope that can be found in Jesus Christ. You're not ever alone. You're not ever isolated. You're not ever abandoned. But with every miracle Jesus did, there were always bigger things going on. Anytime you look at one of his miracles, it would be a good question to ask, what else is happening here? What bigger deal is he trying to make? What bigger point? And that's the case here. There's at least 3 bigger issues that were happening. For example, he did this miracle on the Sabbath day. Verse 9 says, the man took up his bed, he was made well, took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. So we can think about how exciting it was. The man got up and he started walking, and this is all great, and he's happy, and the people in the room are like looking around, and it's the Sabbath day. Uh-oh, now he stepped in it. Why didn't Jesus heal him the day before? Why didn't he go there the next day? And then he could have avoided all this controversy. Why did he go in and choose that day for the healing? 3 days earlier. He could have gone there a week before. He could have healed him from 20 miles away before he even got to town. He was trying to expose something. Because look what verse 10 says. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." Is that one of the most ridiculous things you've ever heard in your whole life? The guy has been an invalid for nearly 4 decades. He finally, instantly can walk. He's not on crutches learning. He's not in the therapy room between the 2 parallel bars trying to figure it out. He's walking out of there. Tisk, tisk. No, 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 no. It's the Sabbath. What are you doing with your bedroll? By the way, what shape do you think his bedroll was in after he'd been laying on it for 38 years? Why that was part of the instructions, actually, I'm not even sure. Take up your bed. I'd rather not. How about I just walk out empty-handed? Take up your bed. You can't carry your bed. It's the Sabbath. Jesus was trying to expose to them and to us what legalism does. It kills and stifles the work of God because it puts the whole focus on the rules. Those Jews think they're doing a good thing because they're enforcing the Sabbath. And they've missed the work of God. They can't even appreciate a changed life because they're so locked into their religious rituals. Their focus is so on the rules, they miss a changed life. Verse 11 is kind of interesting. The man answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" I don't know, this guy just came up to me and he told me to get up and leave. So I got up and left, and I've never got up and left anywhere in 38 years. And then they said to him, they asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" And the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in the place. Isn't that fascinating? The guy didn't even know his name. He got away before too quick. I can't remember his name. I'm never good with names. He got away too fast. So that brings up, one is, why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath? He could have done it the day before, day after. He was trying to expose legalism, the rules, for the killer that it is to spiritual vitality. But he also had another point, and so we'll ask this question: why did he heal just that one guy? What about all the rest of the people in the room? Do you think they were happy for him? I mean, what's that guy? How does he get away with this? What'd he do today that this was his day? And he's not even wet. He wasn't the pool. How did he do that? It wasn't because of how long he'd been sick. It wasn't because the amount of faith that he had. Jesus healed one man and then disappeared, just blended in with the crowd, and he was gone. Now, the implication of this is huge for those with disabilities and diseases. Jesus walked into a room of invalids and he healed only one of them. And that's hard to take, because we all want to be hopeful that there will be a miracle. But the fact is that even that man eventually came to his death. The miracles of Jesus are a preview of what ultimately will come. They're a reminder that this world is broken, but we're made for a different place. We're made for a different world. Christ's first coming was a foretaste of his power. It showed us that he can calm storms, but he doesn't calm every storm. We spent our couple of nights, our grain bin crew in Greensburg, Kansas. Nearly everything in the town is new in the last 11 years. He doesn't calm every storm. But the full healing of his people and all their diseases and all of their disabilities are awaiting someday. It's called heaven. It's called the second coming. And all of those miracles at his first coming are previews of what will happen at his second. It makes us eager for them. It makes us eager for the day when the paralyzed will walk again, when the migraines will stop, when the loneliness will be no more, and the depression isn't there anymore. It makes us eager for that. Revelation 21 and verse 4. It says, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There'll be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. Someday, all illness, all will be eradicated. But until then, we have previews. You know what else we have, by the way? We have Christians called to compassion to bring hope and health and assistance into the brokenness that we see. God should do something about those problems over there. He has. He's called the church. And he's called individuals from the church. He's called his followers to step into the breach, to step into the brokenness. I love what Isaiah 58, about the whole chapter, goes on, talking about the brokenness in our world and how God calls his people to step into the brokenness and provide aid and comfort and healing. And God has a name for those kinds of people, it finally says in verse 13. They're a healer of the brokenness, a restorer of the wall. Jesus left hundreds, probably, unhealed. It says there was a great multitude there. Now we know God's capable of miracles. And many of you have prayed that way for different illnesses and areas of your life. And even though he had all the power to heal everyone in that room, he did not. He did not at that time bring in the age of perfect health and wholeness. But we long for the day when he does. It was Elizabeth Elliot who said it like this, a phrase I love. Heaven is not here, it is there. And if we got everything that we wanted here, we would not want to go there. You see, the illness and the brokenness and the disease of here causes us to want to go there. There's another bigger issue going on here. Verse 14. Afterward, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Legalism kills, doesn't it? Jesus found the man at the temple. There were probably 100,000 people at the temple that day. And Jesus found the man? I think he knew right where he was. What was the bigger issue there? He healed him for holiness. His healing was not an end in itself, even for that man. And he was teaching us that God blesses us to be a blessing to others. He was healed so that he would be holy. He said, I've made you well, now go and sin no more. I healed you to make you holy. My aim in healing your body was to heal your soul. I've given you a gift. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. I chose you. And I healed you. Now live as one that's been given a new gift. The physical healing of this man is a picture of the spiritual healing that we will have one day. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, there's several verses that talk about the brokenness of this world and the eagerness that it creates for us in the next. And starting in verse 1, it compares our bodies to a tent, a temporary dwelling place. And we know that if our temporary dwelling, our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. We have a perfect, healthy body one day in heaven. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. We can't wait till we get to heaven and have the perfect body. How many got up this morning and groaned? The joints were a little stiff. The head was a little groggy. The Bible uses the word groaning. In Romans chapter 8, it uses, I think, the same word. It's in verse 23 of Romans chapter 8. And it talks to us about the same kind of thing there, where it says, we ourselves are groaning, eagerly waiting for the ultimate redemption of our body, the adoption into God's family in heaven, when we're ultimately redeemed and our bodies don't ache and they're not hurt. And there's hope. This isn't the end of the story. There's more to come. The best days are yet to come. It's called heaven. And if we got everything we wanted here and now, we'd never want to go there, and we'd be all satisfied here. And all that groaning, literally and figuratively, is because God is calling us, trying to draw our attention away from earthly things, away from making idols out of this thing that's so temporary, our bodies, and calling us to something bigger, eternity with Him. And so when He disappeared out of that place, trying to avoid a big crowd, He was trying to let us know that our best days are yet to come. They're not here and now. And a lot of us that get into hopelessness and despair, it happens when we're expecting this life to be heaven. We're expecting everything to work out, and all of our relationships to work, and all of our companionships, and all the parts of our bodies to all just work. We were made for another place. Oh, how we long to be there. Would you stand with me, please, in closing prayer? With your heads bowed and eyes closed, I guess we could say it like this. Our hope is way too short-sighted. I hope my headache gets better by lunchtime. Hope my knee feels better next week. Hope to find a wife someday or a husband, within the next year. Hope I graduate from high school. Hope I get a job after college. And God's saying, This isn't heaven, but I'm preparing a place for you. And I can't wait till you come and join me there. I long for you to be with me. That's when every tear will be wiped away and you will no longer groan, because you will do away with the temporary dwelling and you will have your permanent, perfect heavenly body. God in heaven, I thank you for the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. I pray that none of us leave here with the despair that this man felt. I have no one. You've raised up a church body of people to rally around and to belong, a place to belong. And you've demonstrated through this miracle, you've given us a preview of what is to come. And the groaning in this life, God, only makes us more eager, makes us long for the day when every tear is wiped, every sorrow is gone, and every pain is gone. And we're in the place that you've prepared for us, heaven. Forgive us for the times that we expect heaven to be here, and create a greater longing than ever in us for there. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.